following is a local resident producers program. The program content is the sole responsibility of the producer and does not necessarily reflect the views or policies of CATV2, Oshkosh Community Media Services, the City of Oshkosh, or Time Warner Cable.
Hi everyone, welcome to Eye on Oshkosh. Cheryl Hentz here along with Dan Rylance. Very pleased to welcome back a couple of candidates who are running in the upcoming November election. They've been on individually in the past. This time we're very pleased to have them on together. To my left is the Republican candidate seeking an office in the 53rd Assembly District, Dick Spanbauer, and next to him is the Democratic challenger, who is Jeff Mann. And welcome to both of you.
Welcome to both. Thank you.
Thanks for being here. We're going to spend
inviting.
the full hour with you guys tonight and try and cover a lot of issues. So we'll just jump right into it. Why don't, and you each have been on before, as I mentioned, but why don't you just briefly tell the audience and us, in case someone missed you on the first time, why you're running for office. Dick, why don't I start with you?
I've served for more than 30 years in town government. I'm elected for almost 20. I'm presently the chairman for the town of Algoma. It's a town of about 6,400 people. I've been on every committee that you can think of: planning and zoning, land comprehensive, site plan, commercial planning, border review, water and sewer. I mean, many things I've been involved in. You know, and I think that's that experience is needed in Madison.
Okay, Jeff?
Well, I am 29 years old. I live in the town of Algoma, not all that far from Dick, actually. Married and have a little boy. My wife's a police officer for the city of Oshkosh. I am a lawyer with my own office in the city. And really the reason why I'm running is, well, one reason is because I look at 10-year look-back period. 10 years ago, gas was about $1.12 a gallon. Tuition at UW Oshkosh was about $3,000. Tuition now at UW Oshkosh is about $6,000 a year. It's essentially doubled. And we literally have legislators falling asleep during the session. I find that unacceptable. And I also am a big proponent of term limits. I think the days of the career politician need to come to an end.
Okay. Well, let me ask a question about that, because interestingly enough, that very discussion came up at a family gathering this past weekend. And, you know, the comment was made that the term limits are actually the people's vote. You know, if they are opposed to something that a particular election or a politician rather has done, or they just don't like that person anymore, they can vote him out of office, and that's your term limit. How would you respond to that?
Well, I think the problem is that you have an individual who gets so entrenched in that position that complacency sets in. And they almost expect the position, that it's theirs, quote unquote. And I think that what happens is it discourages a lot of candidates from running. A lot of, you know, fresh voices. And listen, I think that the term representative still means something. I think to be truly representative of a larger whole, you need to have different voices, different perspectives, philosophies. And having one person legislate for 15 to 20 years is not a good idea. And yeah, you can, that's true, you can vote them out, but I think that the problem is a lot of people are discouraged from running, are scared to run against people that have been in there forever.
Okay. So what would be your time limit?
For this particular position, I would say probably 3 terms, so that'd be 6 years.
Okay. So if you're elected and you continue to get elected, after 3 terms, you will automatically not run again?
I personally won't, no.
Okay.
Whether there's term limits or not, I won't.
All right. Dick, what do you feel about term limits?
Well, he mentioned something that I agree with on the complacency. I think that is human nature. You do have a tendency, I'm not saying everybody, by the way, in the legislature, both sides, state senate, Democrat, Republican, you have a certain amount of complacency. That is true. I've run across that with other legislators, and they do tend to kind of hang on, we'll call it. And only when they get competition, then all of a sudden, woo, I got to wake up, they say, and I got to start looking at the issues. And I think we see that a lot on less things getting done in the legislature. I don't think they have their heart and soul into it like you should have if you've been serving a number of years. However, I'm not for term limits yet. If I was, if the state senate term is 4 years, I would say 2 4-year terms for state senate, but 4 terms, which would be 8 years for the legislator.
Be the same for both houses.
Be the same. But I'm not for term limits at this point, because I do know there are some good, faithful legislators that have a lot of experience and a lot to offer, and people that do work hard in the legislature. But Jeff brings up a good point.
Okay.
Just to follow up on term limits?
Sure.
How would you implement it? I mean, does this have to be constitutional? Legislative? Do you know?
Well, it would have to be constitutional.
Okay.
You would have to run a, it'd have to be a constitutional amendment change.
Okay. So what's the reality? Professional legislators are going to pass a constitutional amendment that are going to limit their terms.
I know what you're driving at. They're not going to do it.
I wouldn't have a problem doing a referendum on it, even.
You can't.
That's only advisory, even if you did
Well,
have
Yeah, you could do advisory, but you couldn't initiate
do a legally binding referendum.
And it would have to pass the legislature twice without a change. So I mean, that's tough.
What the problem really basically is you don't get a lot of competition. You see that with your own county board here in Winnebago County. Fond du Lac County is the same way. You don't get any competition, and that's the biggest problem. There's a lot of apathy out there, more so than when I started serving. People were really, for the most part, dedicated, wanted to serve, wanted to get involved. They were there for a reason. I'm afraid that's changed a lot to a point where there's too many people on boards that don't belong on boards. They're on there for the wrong reasons.
Well, and we should just say for the record here that Jeff and Dick are seeking the position vacated by Carol Owens, who has, I hate to use the word elected not to run again, but for lack of a better word, she's chosen not to run again. And, and from my own standpoint, I think she's one of those who developed some complacency as time went on. And certainly she was one who, as you had mentioned, Jeff, legislators sleeping. She's one of them who actually had photos of her taken sleeping during meetings.
Yeah,
so.
I don't want to beat a dead horse, but that was the reason why I ran against her twice. I had a lot of chairmen and other towns and that, and say, Dick, hey, we'll back you, because they knew I had a lot of experience. I'm involved in a lot of stuff, but we need somebody different in the legislature. I don't want to bash her. I mean, she put a lot of years in,
Yes, she did.
that a lot of people don't, so I can't bash her. But yes, that complacency is very well known.
Well, and falling asleep on the job, I mean, really, that's nowhere else would that be acceptable. And I just don't think it's acceptable for her either, no matter how well she may know an issue or whatever. She may have been missing some important discussion prior to a vote being taken. So anyway, go ahead.
This is a presidential election. You each have a candidate of your party that's running. Can you tell us a little bit about what has been the impact of you campaigning in your district as far as presidential politics? What are you hearing?
I can begin this one.
Okay.
Great example is Waupun. Historically, people told me, well, you're going to get a pretty conservative base in the city of Waupun. And I go around, and a lot of people will indicate to me, I've voted conservative for most of my life, but I just can't do it anymore. And I think what you're seeing is, hopefully, hopefully, if Barack Obama is elected, this will turn out to be a good thing. But I think a lot of people are fed up. I think particularly over the last 8 years. And the impression that I'm getting is Barack Obama at least seems to be effectively able to reach over and get some people that are a slightly leaning Democrat or an independent. And I think that he has somewhat energized that particular demographic. So I do think it's played a part, and I think it probably will play a part in local politics if it has a trickle-down effect like I think it will.
How about you, Dick? What are you hearing?
Well, I think Jeff is right to a point. Anytime they're mad at the top, it can tend to filter down to the lower levels. But I'm getting a good response back, and I think the reason why is I've noticed something different in all the years I've been campaigning, that people are not voting as much the party anymore. It's like, you know, I vote more Republican, but not so much anymore. I like to look at the candidate and the issues. One of the reasons why I've gotten a lot of support is because of the fact I'm a moderate. Moderate meaning that if I'm willing to look in the legislature at the other side of the aisle, if there's a Democrat that has a good bill, super bill for my district, am I supposed to look at him and say, you know, you got a great bill, but guess what? You're a Democrat, I'm a Republican? You know, there's a certain thing in the legislature, and I hope to change that, by the way, and I know there's other guys in hiding that are legislators. I hope to change that by the fact of working across the aisle. Too many of them vote down the straight down the party line. That is wrong. I think one thing I've always disliked about my predecessor is the fact, and anybody else that votes down the party line, is I'm chairman for the Winnebago Towns Association. And I've had Carol Owens come once or twice to the meetings and that, but I've talked to other legislators also. And the thing is, if you ask them about some of the bills, they can't tell you about them. Do you know why? Very simple. I figured that out real quick. Is if they know how they're going to vote in advance, why study the bills? And that's wrong. That's not what your role is down there. You are to study the bills as diligently as possible and make a very, you know, educated guess, if it's going to be a guess or whatever. Do the research, do the due diligence, as they say. And if it happens to be a Democrat, you may find me voting for a Democrat.
Just one thing on the presidential.
On his issue.
I don't know the 53rd District. I didn't check presidential tallies for 2004 and 2000. My guess is, correct me if I'm wrong, that the 53rd District had voted for Bush both in 2004 and 2000.
I think that would be accurate.
Yeah. My question to each of you is, how much will a McCain victory in the 53rd District help you? Will it trickle down? And Jeff's same thing. What if Obama does really well in the 53rd District? Will that have shirt tails for Jeff? In other words, are you as Republican or Democrat somewhat tied to the number of votes that your candidate will get for president?
I don't think there's a Republican legislature leader out there that doesn't hope to God that McCain does real well in Wisconsin.
Okay.
For that simple reason.
Because
What I would be afraid of is people will take it out on me because they don't like Bush or they don't like McCain. And I think that would be unfair, rather than looking at the issues, the candidate, and not just saying, well, I don't care, I'm voting for any Democrat, I don't care who he is. Now, people do vote like that, and that's wrong. They vote on emotion rather than common sense.
There's U.S. senators in Oregon and North Carolina that a month ago had safe Republican seats, and they're looking at the polls and they're saying, why are they taking it out on me? The same point that you made.
But it's true.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Yeah.
The only thing I'd like to add to that is, before I made the decision to run for the 53rd District, I actually went and saw Barack Obama speak at the Gulf Sports Center. That was back in February. And I actually find myself agreeing with him on a lot of points. Education, healthcare, a universal system. You know, those are two big issues for me, and two that I pretty much have aligned myself with him in terms of thinking. My hope is that the individual who watches Barack Obama, you know, sees him, hears his message, may not have heard mine necessarily, maybe will watch this show, and they'll look at that and say, you know what, here's a guy that, you know, can identify with the guy, you know, who's running for the President of the United States. You know, some of these people I think are going to come out this time around, are going to have never voted before. They just realize how important it is. The last 8 years have had a devastating effect. Particularly, I mean, you look around, look at the loss of jobs. You know, a fair trade versus a free trade. I think and that's what I'm hoping. I hope people will associate me with Barack Obama's line of thinking. This is a new, kind of a fresh look on things. Let's get some fresh blood in there. You know, if we're right, great. If we're not, we'll have to correct it down the road. Okay. But we don't know if we don't take the chance.
You know, when I saw that with Carter in '76, and to me, to this day, I think he was probably one of the most honest presidents we ever had. However, he was very naive, in my opinion. He let the military and defense go down, everything else, because he thought all he had to do was just hug Brezhnev and kiss him on both sides of the cheek, and he would respond. And he learned a lesson. Reagan had his hands full, the stuff I read, with the military and the way the defense was let go. because Carter was trying to prove we're good guys. We're gonna, we're not gonna build that ABM system or that, whatever. My biggest concern in this world that we live in is defense, and I've never been for a liberal that way for that reason. Defense to me is very, very important. And also one other thing, first time I've ever seen a Republican, McCain, and his running mate, Palin, and the other speakers at the convention, and still on some of these shows that he's on, mention the fact that it's, which I've been saying for a long time as a moderate, it's people first, party second. I do like that. That tells me an awful lot about McCain.
You want to talk about?
Yeah, just about Jimmy Carter. I was actually 1 year old. Well, I wasn't even 1 year old when he came into, or when he ended his his only term. And the only thing I'll say about this, I'm not going to debate whether or not he was effective or not. And I have a lot of respect. I'm probably one of those. The term Reagan Democrat has been thrown around a little bit this election. I'm probably pretty close to that. But I will say this much about Jimmy Carter. Number one, he inherited the country at an awful time. Things weren't going well. We're coming out of Vietnam. Number two, what are we all talking about right now? Wind, ethanol, alternative energy. This is the same message this same guy was touting 30 years ago. So in some respects, the guy's a visionary.
Now, Dick was sort of giving Jimmy Carter a passing grade. What would you give President Bush?
You're asking a Democrat?
I will.
He didn't mention Bush.
It's the jury is still out on this one. I think at this point, if we're swinging by public opinion and what I've done of the seat I've seen, I'd say probably about a C minus.
You must be grading on a curve.
Boy.
You're a good grader.
The whole country is not happy with Bush, and that includes a lot of Republicans for that matter. But I do respect, he's very conscientious about defense. There's one thing that he'll never get probably credit for, at least publicly. He'll always be seen as the guy that was in the Iraq War and started that, and the people, they think that was a useless war. Maybe it is, history will tell in time. But the fact is, after 9/11, he instituted a lot of tax credits, tax incentives to businesses, and we were coming out of that recession, if you remember quite correctly. The market started going way up. Sales were doing good in real estate. Everything was going, but people will not comment on that. It's the present.
Yeah. One of my big gripes with the George Bush era was particularly the No Child Left Behind. I can tell you right now, if somebody told me how to practice law, they told me this is what you have to do, X, Y, and Z, I think it would severely limit my ability to represent people, at least coming up with creative ways and ultimately successful ways. No two people would practice law or teach, for that matter, exactly alike. And I think to bind their hands like that is a real error, is a real mistake.
Dick, well, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, some of those programs were not as effective as originally at why they were put in. For that matter, I'd have to kind of agree to a point there as far as that goes. The concept was there and the heart was behind it for the right reasons, but that doesn't mean the program was going to work, and it's had a lot of hard times. And you know something, that's another thing in the legislature. If I'm elected and go down there, we've got to start looking at a lot of programs that don't work and we're paying a lot of money for.
We're going to get into the budget here because Doyle this morning said, my question was, what are you going to do with a shortfall of $1 or $2 billion? He says this morning it may be as high as $3 billion. So, we'll talk about that. Huh?
Yeah. I want to touch on health care since
right.
Jeff.
And I think we should get into some issue differences on them.
Yep. Jeff, you'd mentioned health care and something that is like a national plan. In the event that doesn't happen, I think we have to look at maybe something statewide. In the state of Wisconsin, there are approximately 91% of residents in the state have some type of employer-sponsored health care. But even though that's a very high number, it still leaves 450,000 people in Wisconsin who are underinsured or uninsured altogether. So if Barack Obama does not get in, or he gets in and his dream of having, national health care fails, do we need to do something at a state level?
I think so, and I actually will say here tonight that I would be willing to support a Healthy Wisconsin type program. The only thing that does concern me in this issue is that the businesses, particularly small businesses, are going to be expected to shoulder a rather heavy burden, initially at least. Now all the statistics I've seen seem to indicate that in the long run, that Healthy Wisconsin would actually save businesses money. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. We're looking at extrapolations here. But I think that, and this is where I come from on this issue, I believe that every legal citizen is entitled to a basic form of health care. That's how I feel about that. I think that if we're going to afford everybody legal representation, I think they sure ought to have quality health care.
Okay, Dick?
Well, I'm not for the universal health care, and it's not that I don't care about people. I'm not compassionate as far as them having health insurance. That's not my issue. I'm looking at it differently. It's very expensive. If this is implemented, this is going to be a burden on both the employer and possibly the employee. Even though they're going to be benefiting, there's still going to be a certain amount of tax that has to be paid for that. The employers, we're trying to produce jobs, and we're trying to bring in more industry. And when you produce more jobs, you produce more tax, more employees. When they are earning wages, they pay tax. You're bringing in more revenue. I think to implement something this expensive would discourage employers from hiring additional people. I really feel strong about that. The one thing I do like is the fact of tax credits. If an employee wants to take a job, and the lower paying job, $7, $8, $9 an hour, I would be all for giving him the big benefit or the credit for health insurance. I would applaud somebody that was willing to go out and work $7 or $8, $9 jobs, hour jobs, but at least give him the health insurance if he's willing to work. I do like the Badger Care. That has a lot to do with people that take a lower paying job. I can't take my hat off enough to people that are willing to go out and work, no matter what it is. If it's at McDonald's for $6.75 an hour or whatever they get, or working in a factory that has very little coverage. I mean, you have to take your hat off to people like that. You really do.
Well, I understand what you're saying about Badger Care, Dick, but I also know there are some people who are able-bodied. And there's really, and I know this personally because I've come across these folks. They are able-bodied, capable of working, and yet they have been in this system for so long that they have found ways to stay in it so that they don't have to work. And if they do go to work, they find ridiculous reasons to quit. Like a waitress who doesn't like the type of apron she's being asked to wear, and honest to God, that's the truth.
No,
I know of a case like that. And because she has children, she's getting Badger Care. And yet you've got other folks out there who are working their rear ends off day in and day out, and because they don't have children, they fall through the cracks, or they may not meet some of the other criteria, and they fall through those cracks. And what are we supposed to do with those people?
In the interest of being short before, that was number 2 here. I overlooked it. I wanted to get to the meat and potatoes. But that was, as you can see on here, I wrote down somebody not working. I don't care. That's another thing with that universal health care. Why should we give insurance to somebody that lives with mom and pa as 28 years old, and there's a lot of them, and doesn't want to get out and work? Why should I give him health insurance and pay my taxes?
These people aren't living, some of these people aren't living with their mother and father, though. They're living in publicly funded Section 8 housing. So we're picking up the tab for their rent, too. So
how does welfare work? Doesn't welfare say you've got to work? Then we change the law on that. It's not perfect, but I think we should operate.
This doesn't require that.
Well, we should operate the same way.
So then we need to change Section 8 housing. I guess.
Jeff wants to
Can
go
I
back.
just bring
to
up
ahead.
one
Go
point
ahead.
about
Sure.
health care? Important thing to remember is you have individuals that don't have health care, okay? These same individuals essentially are using our emergency rooms as their primary care physician. Where do those costs go? The hospital eats them, and they get passed down to us in the forms of higher co-pays, premiums, and deductibles. I really think that if we at least examine this, I think we could actually end up saving money in the back end of this.
Well, I was going to make that point, is that I understand what you're saying, Dick, that it's going to be expensive to implement, but we are already spending about $1 gazillion. That's a stretch, but we are spending an inordinate amount of money picking up the slack, if you will, for those who have no insurance or are underinsured.
Well, and
that goes
Dick,
to your point.
Dick's got some good points. I mean, I think everything begins and ends with responsible spending. I was reading an article not that long ago about the state of Wisconsin spent $20-odd million on a computer program for taxes that they never even used. I mean, if we take all the wasted money we have and we pool it all together, I think we could probably make some real headway in some meaningful areas. But we just have to start with prioritizing what is most important. You know, I think everybody would agree: education, healthcare, you know, economy, you know, local businesses. I think these are all areas that we have to look at. And, you know, a computer software program for 20-odd million that we don't even use. I think if we start looking at, you know, what is most important to us, we start cutting the wasteful spending, I think we could actually get something like a healthy Wisconsin off the ground.
He brings up a good point too, because that triggers me with the budget overrun on the transportation fund a few years ago. That was huge. And what I think we have to do, like I said in the beginning, is so whoever goes down to Madison is going to have to scrutinize these programs, if they work or don't work or whatever. And we need better management. I mean, you can tell that on budget overruns. Transportation, I think, was $250 million overrun, or was it 300? I don't remember exactly, but I remember reading that in the paper, and it was an issue for about a month on that. And actually, it was just small articles. It was kept, you know, very low. But you need better management down there for that matter, and you need to look at programs that are wasteful. Because, like I say, if here's another thing, health insurance, you're looking at a cost and a half. We're trying to get past a budget deficit before you even talk about other programs that you have to support or that needs legitimate increases. Education is a big one, for that matter. Still transportation, or bridges, our infrastructure. If we want to bring in new jobs, you need to have the infrastructure to entice them to come here, besides the tax credits and tax incentives that you give them. And so
you've got written there, bring in new jobs, and you just said it. So
Always.
let's talk about
Always.
jobs.
Just one
Sure,
final
go
on healthcare. It summarizes, if I'm incorrect, tell me, but it seems to me you both articulate the view of your presidential candidate. If I hear Jeff right, he says healthcare is a right of citizenship.
Yes, absolutely.
You say it has to be earned, which is basically McCain's position. Is that correct?
yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I just because you
Yeah.
are, you know, from two parties.
I'm not
and-
trying to make somebody better than another person,
No.
or a stature or whatever. I'm trying to give due credit to somebody that's
Sure.
willing to work, even if it's a lower paying job. Give him the health insurance with the scrutinization I think you were hitting on before.
In a civilized nation in the 21st century, in a rich country that we live in, there's no reason why any legal citizen should go without health care.
Especially when we can fund some of the other things, and now we're getting into the Iraq war situation, and they've got all this surplus, and you know we're in this huge deficit situation. But I think we need to, as a country, as a state, as a community, start looking at what we're funding, and we need to prioritize what we're funding. And I think healthcare is one of those things that needs to be a high priority.
But you just hit a word. I'm not totally 100% against universal health care, but you're going to have to do a lot of management and organization to even see if there are going to be people that fall through the cracks that shouldn't be getting the insurance, like you were mentioning before. It takes a lot of planning. It ain't something you just pass in a legislature. Now everybody's going to get insurance. There has to be one heck of an organization set up to govern that, to make those mandates work and work honestly, for that matter. Besides the money, I don't think we can do it.
Okay.
Want to go to something else?
Sure, yeah, let's move on to jobs, because Dick has written here in big capital letters, bring in new jobs. And he said it at least once, so we're going to talk about bringing in new jobs. You know, we've lost a lot of manufacturing jobs. Although, ironically enough, here in the New North region, which is an 18-county region, you know, this area in particular is part of that, we have actually gained an increase of 1% in manufacturing jobs in the last year or so. And in fact, manufacturing jobs in this New North region still comprise about 22% of our entire workforce. That being said, we can still use more. So what would both of you do if you're elected to help the state and this area kind of revitalize itself, bring in new jobs? whoever wants to go.
I'll
Dick,
go first.
ahead.
Oshkosh, I think, tries to do a very good job in doing that. On the local level, I've paid very close attention to their economic development corporations, Chamber of Commerce, and they bend over backwards trying to bring in business, try to accommodate them, give them TIF. There's TIF districts. I mean, they try to go all out. As far as I'm concerned, maybe some people would disagree, but from what I see, I'm judging that based on what I see, the fact of setting up business. There's no reason why we can't promote. You ever see Jeff Daniels, the actor on TV?
With Michigan?
The Michigan.
Dumb and Dumber.
Did you see the job? Yeah. Well, that was the movie. But I mean, he's promoting.
These guys are good.
Yeah. And nice to each other.
We're neighbors.
Yeah, we are.
But anyway, you see the job he does and the way they've got that organized. Don't you think at a minimum that Michigan is getting a look at by industry or business? Sure. And why can't we do the same thing? Why can't we offer the same tax incentives, the whole bit, the tax credits, and get more business in here instead of discouraging them with higher taxes? And that's why they're leaving the state. We even have, that's another issue you guys don't know, we have a lot of people that have money, developers or whatever, that have residency in Florida. They live here half the year, and I'm finding this out every year, that they have residency in Florida. And the fact the taxes, they say, is so much cheaper down in Florida. I'm better off and I can afford maintaining a residence here. And then in the winter, of course, I go down to Florida, they say, and get away from the tax structure.
You're going to have to forgive me. I'm kind of argumentative by nature just by what I do. And I look for counter examples. And we might have had a 1% increase. Let's not forget something, though, okay? We've got, my dad used to work for both Morgan Company as well as the Radford Company. Basically, for all intents and purposes, both ceased to exist. Ripon Foods just laid off a bunch of people. Mercury Marine is, I mean, it's no picnic over there. We got some real crisis in this area. My first thing I think we need to do in terms of attracting, Dick brought up tax incremental financing. I think tax rates, you know, favorable tax rates. I think these are things we can explore. One thing I'm personally excited about, and the Democrats, at least in this state, have proposed, is more of a new influx of green jobs. And when I say green, alternative energy. 53rd District is great. We have an untapped resource here, gold, if you will. The people, well, they know about it, but they don't think about it. A lot of farms. Well, farms produce an awful lot of manure, which can be eventually processed for methane. I think if we can produce, we can set up, and it's going to take initial subsidies off the bat. One thing I hear a lot about is people are upset with the ethanol subsidies. You know, I'm not saying they should be long-term, but I think initially to get them started and off the ground, I think it's worth exploring. But I think a methane plant in this district would be good for the local economy. That's one thing I would propose. And I think you're killing a lot of birds with one stone. You got jobs. You are also preventing runoff, possibly into our water system. And you got a clean, renewable, you know, source of energy. I think it's a no-brainer, but it's not going to come cheap, and I'm cognizant of that. I think another big thing is protecting the jobs that are here, retaining the business that we have here. One thing I would propose, and we did this about 20 years ago, pre-NAFTA, if you will, where there's a big campaign for U.S.-made products. Why not offer incentives to local merchants that are willing to go local, that are willing to sell local products in their store? Have big areas, signs, advertising campaigns, with assistance if they're willing to engage in this. But have a campaign that says, you know, you're buying from Wisconsin, and then when you go in there, you can be proud of the fact that, hey, I bought this, you know, this block of cheese, or, you know, whatever, this brooms, I don't know, this item was made in Wisconsin. I think that would be good. I think let people know where the items are coming from.
Okay.
Some years ago, a few years ago, Steve Dito ran as a Democrat, him and Luann Byrd. And one thing that he had mentioned that I like is the fact that he had brought up the fact of our John Deere plants that we have in Wisconsin. Stuff is made here in Wisconsin. That's great. It's got jobs. It stays in the state, the whole ball of wax. But he had proposed talking about eliminating or at least cutting back greatly the sales tax that one buys from John Deere. Giving them a tax incentive like the farmers buying equipment and that. In other words, you see a lot of foreign stuff. I don't like to see that. NAFTA is a good point. You know, people are buying something from Belgium or Japan or China, whatever it is. What's wrong with John Deere? And giving them an incentive for people to buy it, maybe giving them a credit in the form of the sales tax or something like that. When you're talking a sales tax on a $250,000 combine or something like that, you're talking some money. But things of that nature. Protect the jobs that we have now in the state, and rather than them leaving, and that's what's happening. The biggest disappointment was the Leach Company. They had promised that they were going to stay when they were sold. And even Leach people were under that impression. Here they turned around, they outfit from Canada, and they took off. Thank God we had Oshkosh Truck that came in and put that plant back in, in shape enough to, give people jobs and keep the tax base going. So that, I mean, you've got to keep offering incentives, but you never stop doing that. And that's where complacency can get in sometimes. You take your job for granted. When you're in a job as a legislator, it's more than just sitting there and voting yay or nay. You've got to be active, and you've got to be looking all the time for ideas to bring in business into the state of Wisconsin.
Follow up on alternate energy. Is there wind energy currently in the 53rd District?
Yes.
Yes.
There is.
Town of Byron.
On Oakfield.
Oakfield, Byron, yeah.
Potential for more?
Yeah, the only problem is, I've often said that when you do that, you got to have a parameter for that. You can't just throw it in somebody's backyard, because they had a lot of grief down there. And the grief is kind of normal in a sense where people didn't want it. But the thing is, anything new, people normally will reject anyway, but you have to have good planning.
I also think, to add on to that, to take a scientific approach, we need to put these where we're going to get to maximize, the bang for the buck. I like to see them strategically placed, spread out, but I also want them in places where there's going to be, wind generated, such as around the Lake Winnebago. You notice, it's not by accident you have those along Lake Winnebago. Right. The wind comes off there. And I think that we should use a scientific approach too when we do this, rather than just plopping them in any piece of land.
Well, and ironically enough, all those wind turbines that we're seeing, that's where some of this new growth in manufacturing jobs has come from. It's from finding different things to manufacture than what we've kind of known over the years.
Can I just make one final final comment on alternative energy? One thing I want to make very clear is, while I'm a big proponent of it, I want to make darn sure, though, that these turbines, these plants that are being set up, I want to make sure these are individuals from, preferably the 53rd or the 54th District, but Wisconsin people working at these places, assembling these items, these machinery, putting them up, and most of all, I want to make sure that this energy that's being produced is going to Wisconsin communities. This area. I don't want going down to Lake Forest, Illinois.
Yeah. It's a tough call to do that.
Yeah,
I know it is.
That's a real
I know
tough
it is. I know it is, but I'm just saying.
Your point's well taken, though.
Let's do some issues. Why don't one of you start with an issue that you think is important to you, and then let the other person respond, and see if we can get a little dialogue going. So take one issue that you're running on, that you're going to do in Madison.
Well, there's two right off the bat.
Okay, just one
I
now
know,
to start.
that's kind of tough.
Maybe flip.
Communication in our district is essential. We don't have that. People don't trust us politicians. That is bad. We've got to establish, I have to establish a confidence and a trust back into this district. That means going to the meetings. You can't make every one when you got 20 towns, but I mean going to the meetings, keeping in touch. Coming into a meeting and saying, hey, by the way, I'm Dick Spanbauer, your state rep. I got something for you from Madison. Might help your town. Okay, you're a village or wherever you're at, City of Waupun. If you don't have anything, is there something I can bring back to Madison? It's that touch. People are they're right in some ways. You get elected and they never see you anymore. The balance in the budget, that's going to be a dandy.
Okay, we'll get to that. But communication, do you want to respond to that? Is there a need for communication?
I would put it at the top of my list.
Okay.
Absolutely. I would concur with Dick just by going door to door.
Absolutely.
There is definitely in-ground distrust, if you will, for politicians. And I think a lot of that does become, more often than not, you go out, shake some hands, you go to a chicken barbecue, you talk a little bit, you never see the politician again. If they get elected, more often than not, you may be lucky to see them again. A lot of the
election time, that's when you see them again.
Yeah, every 2 years, every 4 years. And that has to change. If you're going to be a representative government, that has to change. Things aren't that static that they stay the same.
This is a tough district. to run communication on it. And I mean, it's big area, right?
It is a big area.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like Oshkosh where it's you know, contiguous.
But you know, my plan personally, the first thing I would do if I get elected, is to get that phone book out, the government section, and look for every town clerk in this district, and start setting up places and times to meet. And then the second part of that equation is you have to publish that and make sure people know about it, because it doesn't do you any good if you have it, you know, down the street, but you know they don't know. But you need to make sure people know about it. I think that'd go a long ways in starting to rebuild that faith.
Sure. Well, and to your point, Dick, about communicating with, you know, the leaders in each of these local townships or villages or, you know, what have you, because you do have an awful lot of them. Your district is really weird. It's spread out. The people aren't weird, but the district, the district is weird.
Thank you, Cheryl.
It's spread out all over the place, and you got a whole bunch. What did you say? 20-some
About 20 communities.
You know, and you're absolutely right. You cannot possibly get to every single meeting.
I always envied Gordon Hentz.
Gordon Hentz? Yep.
I always, one town, he's got one newspaper, one buyer's guy, wherever he advertises. I always kid him. Parks his van on a corner, walks 2 hours down the street, crosses the street, comes up 2 hours. He's probably hit 250 homes, gets in his van and moves over.
But you know what? He's a hard-working guy. I saw him on the way over here tonight. He was walking the streets. And you know what? He doesn't just do that at election time. He does that all the time. But, you know, one thing that you could do is since you can't make it to every meeting, you know, at least as an elected official in Madison, you can set all those towns and villages up on an email list and just send them a monthly kind of little bulletin telling them what's going on in Madison, and then make your rounds once in a while, you know, but at least that way you're constantly communicating.
I intend to do that, but the personal touch has more to do than you can ever imagine.
But since you can't do it at every meeting,
well, you can pop in here or there during the return.
Here and there, sure.
There's not a problem doing that, for that matter. But it's that touch that people just are put out with us.
Yeah, but that way you can always stay in contact with them, you know, in between while you're making your rounds, you know.
Jeff, do you want to take an issue?
I really would, because there actually is one issue in particular. I'm going to be a little more specific, because communication is a big thing. I think it goes without saying.
Okay.
One particular issue is, and this is one that is going to affect more of the state employees. There's something called the John Doe Law. Okay, there's 6 prisons in our district, so without a shadow of a doubt, this is an important issue.
How's campaign going on in the prisons?
Yeah. We're talking about the different demographics.
No, I know. I'm just kidding. I'm sorry.
I know. My sense of humor is kind of is dulled the longer I've been a lawyer.
John Doe Law.
Yeah.
John Doe Law. Basically, what it allows for is an inmate to bring a lawsuit against a state employee. Okay. If you live in a county that doesn't have a prison, you probably don't know much about this. Okay. But I can tell you that the corrections officers and certainly the judges know what this is. Oftentimes, you know, whenever a charge is referred, it's normally done so by the district attorney's office. They look at a couple questions. Who does do the allegations answer the questions who, what, when, where, and why? Okay? And if they do, they proceed. If they don't, they're tossed. Well, it works a little bit differently with the John Doe Law. You have an inmate who brings an allegation against a corrections officer. It does not go to a district attorney. In fact, it bypasses it because they're seen as conflicted out, having been the very people that fought against them. It goes right to a judge. I had this conversation with a judge in this very county, and he says, I spend an exorbitant amount of time, way too much time, looking at these. And they're not small documents, they're thick packets. So one reason we look at, well, why do we have such the backlog that we do? Why are we so backed up in the courts? Why are we spending so much time? One thing is because of items like this, and they're not legitimate. I mean, sometimes there are legitimate claims. Somebody
what would
gets
your law
hurt.
do then?
My law would basically bring in a special prosecutor or an independent body, not attached within any of the district attorney's office necessarily, and would oversee these. We're not going to. We let them put the discretion back in the district attorney's hands. Judges should not be wasting time and energy. And I'll tell you another thing. I think this is also going to benefit the corrections officers in the sense that if it's truly legitimate, it goes forward. But if it's not legitimate, like many of them are, for instance, they don't get enough rec time. They didn't get canteen for the day. Okay? that shouldn't be going in front of a judge. Let the DA look at it. If it's good, toss it. If not, it proceeds. But make no mistake about it. There was a young man down in Dodge Correctional Facility down in Waupun. He ended up spending, thousands of dollars defending himself because the union typically doesn't get involved with representation here. So he's basically on the hook. My wife used to be a corrections officer. If somebody would have brought one of those against us when I was in law school, it would have broke us financially.
Okay.
What's your response to that?
Oh, I couldn't agree with him more. In fact, so much to the point, Gordon Hentz and I have talked about that already because Gordy serves on that committee. And I've asked him, I said, if you need a co-sponsor, sponsor a bill to take care of that, I'm all for it. And he said, fine. So Jeff's hit it right on the head.
Let's get to the budget, huh?
Yeah, because we're down to like about 12 minutes.
We need to, and that's his second main point, so should we let him, or do you want to?
No.
Go ahead. He has a solution to the $3 billion deficit in the budget.
Well,
Go ahead.
there is no easy solution.
No,
You either cut the programs all the way across the board, or you talk about raising taxes, and that's not popular. Okay. It's just not popular.
So we're going to cut only.
I don't know if that's the only answer because a lot of people are going to take some bad hits.
Boy, for sure.
And when you're talking, he's talking upwards of $3 billion. I think unless he's talking about the fact of the $1.678 billion, and then on top of that is increases for program, for education, normal programs I'm talking about.
Right.
Maybe that's what he's talking about, having a deficit to start off with. Then you're going to have to do an awful lot of slashing in some areas.
And how would you approach that, Dick?
I don't know. There's no way that I know the nitty-gritty and ins and outs until you're in Madison. I've been told that by every legislator that I talk to. You have to look at all the programs, and you have to go through them, and you have to see what you can do. But you have to somehow do it on a parity. I mean, you have to try and be equal, and that's going to be difficult to do.
Would you put everything on the table to cut?
Everything? Well, you have to look at everything.
That's what Doyle said today. He said everything goes on the table.
Yeah. You have to look at everything. You have to be what you call fair.
Equal or equitable?
Equitable.
Okay.
Yeah, equitable, because I mean, why did you cut my program? Whatever. And you always, people say, don't you raise taxes, and don't you cut my this or that, don't you cut the Medicaid, don't you cut that. Well, give me something. As long as it ain't mine, they say, in effect is what they're saying. It's no easy job. People say, there's a lot of wasteful spending out there, you better go find it, you better cut it. Well, I hope to find it, but suppose I don't.
And then you're left with raising taxes.
And that's the bind that the legislature has given us right now. This is a bad time to be coming into a budget.
Tell me.
They've taken money out of transportation, medical malpractice. They even suggested just talk about state retirement funds and other funds, and they were so used to grabbing out of these funds to patch it. All right, now we can go home, we're done. But now we're going to pay for that, and that's the complacency, not willing to work to find out what really can be cut legitimately. What are the bad funds that are down there? That's what you need to find out.
All right,
Jeff? Yeah.
Balancing the budgets actually, it is going to be difficult, but in theory, it shouldn't be rocket science. It's going to take discipline for one thing, and prioritizing. I think that's the main thing. And I tell you, I've never been a legislator, but I have been able to balance a checkbook, and I know what I can do and what I can't do when my funds are either up or down. One thing that really irritates me, is rating other budgets or rating other departments.
Okay.
I agree.
Every time we get into a shortfall, let's go get transportation, or let's get the conservation or education. You know what? That's ridiculous. Number one, that particular service from which you're drawing from is going to suffer. Number two, it just encourages this perpetuation of reckless, careless spending as long as the lawmaker knows that he or she can draw from that fund. We need to put mandates that if the money is allotted for this, it stays there. If they run out of money, they can possibly draw from the general fund in times of emergencies, but we're not going to start playing the shell game between departments.
Like the tobacco fund, rating that, and that's a one-time funding
That
mechanism
went in
only.
one budget.
One budget.
Yep.
That was terrible.
Yep.
That's robbing Peter to pay Paul is all it amounted to. But lacking the will and the desire to do the job to find out is there another answer rather than robbing funds?
Can I make one more point, though? One thing I've noticed in my campaign is really how divided We are, really, and right down the middle. And this point will become more clear. You know, when I can't go speak to a conservative household for fear of having the police called on me, how are we ever going to be able to pass a budget in this state when you have two competing parties? We really need to figure out where our common ground lies.
Sure, and within those parties, you have people who each have their own pet projects that they don't want to see get cut. And so what we end up with is stagnation. We have continued deficits. We have filibustering. And we have things that just don't get done.
Well, you also have the main ingredient, and that's again why I emphasize being a moderate, is the fact you have Democrats that stand on their side of the aisle and Republicans on this side. And I'm not saying that we should always compromise, but there's a lot of times when I think we should maybe get together a little bit more to think about ways we can agree to disagree and get a budget passed, especially when the last one went for what, 4, 5, 6 months late?
Terrible.
There was no reason for that.
Let me run education. You must have a lot of schools in the 53rd District. Currently, they're getting 2/3, a little less than 2/3, from the state. Would you cut the 2/3 for education for your district?
I would not make cuts at this point, but I will tell you one thing that needs to be restructured is the way that schools are funded.
You want to redo the formula?
Yes, absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you why, because you're already starting to see this up in the northern regions of the state. What's happening is you have the enrollment, and it's a community wealth is two factors in the equation. What's happening though is that people are coming, buying up land up in some of these northern areas. I think Wasaki actually just closed. I think I don't know if they voted to disband their school district or what exactly occurred. But what's happening is these property values are going up. They're getting less money because of that, because there's a direct correlation. But the median income isn't going up. Right. That would be a better indicator of community wealth, I think, than using something such as property value, which can be easily manipulated by out-of-towners.
Okay.
Dick, how about you on education?
Well, yeah, that's good luck is right when you say about the 2/3 funding. That's one thing is the formula is based on pretty much enrollment and the fact of what the district spends, for that matter. There's a real touchy formula there. I don't know the crux of the whole thing or not. But a thought went through my mind in a different way, but didn't last long, and that was because I was thinking about maybe raising the sales tax and having something from that finance part of education. One thing that's happening in education, I noticed with the schools, the classrooms are getting bigger with students. Now, why would that be? There's cutting going on. And after a while, do we have the same standards, of quality education that we had 10 years ago, 5 years ago? When you start cutting the teachers down, you don't hire as many. There's a lot of dedicated teachers that work a lot of hours, and they work overboard. In fact, they even pay for materials that they don't get reimbursed all the time for.
What's your response to it? He didn't say he was going to do a sales tax, but you're courageous for even, I think, bringing it up.
Well,
I guess I'm more
totally
interested in tinkering with the current formula before we start exploring the sales tax.
Right.
I think enrollment is another issue. Yeah. One thing I think is an absolute joke. I used to be the captain of my football and wrestling teams in high school. Okay, I was a jock, but that doesn't mean that I think that, all of a sudden sports, athletics is taking precedence in our high schools. That's a mistake. Open enrollment, in my humble opinion, and I've seen this, I was also a coach, is being used by many is nothing more than a form of high school free agency for sports. That's not what it was intended for. That's not what it was intended for. And I think we really need to put a stopgap program in place in that, because people are losing enrollment, which is losing money ultimately from the budget for their schools, because some kid wants to wrestle in Waterford versus Muskego.
Well, he's got a point. I agree with him. I'm only suggesting way out.
No, I understand. But I commend you for at least raising it.
If you're talking about new funding and change, the formula is one thing. I don't know if that's all practical or not. You still need an injection of new funds, and where are you going to get them from?
Well, here's a thought, and we may have talked about this when you were on last time. I don't remember, Dick, but you know, there are so many corporations out there doing business in the state of Wisconsin that are not paying corporate income tax. And you know, I really and truly believe that if you start closing those loopholes, you're going to generate a lot of money. New tax money. Now, the argument has been made, and mostly by Republicans that we've talked to, both on this show and personally, who've said it's a business killer. You're going to kill off businesses. And I just simply don't believe that. McDonald's, for example, has not left any state in this union because they've been forced to pay state income taxes. So, where do each of you stand on that issue?
You don't take all the, I understand where you're coming from on the loopholes, but you just don't bleed them dry.
How is it bleeding them dry to ask them to pay their fair share?
No. What I'm saying is the fact that everybody, I hear that a lot, tax the corporations. There is a lot of money leaving the state of Wisconsin and going to their headquarters or their main body that they get by with, and they don't pay in the state of Wisconsin.
That's what I'm saying.
I'm against them. You know, taking that much, but I'm talking about when you're talking windfall profits.
No, I'm talking about
it. There are loopholes, but to a certain degree, you know, you've not really mentioned what percentage, how much money, what's the ceiling. You don't want to discourage business. I said before, we need business in the state.
The same amount of corporate income tax that every other business is expected to pay, whatever amount that is, whatever percent that's based on.
That in itself,
the same formula that everyone else is expected to pay.
That when you base it that way, that's fine. But I always hear the talk. Let's get the corporations, and to me, it always sounds like you just want to take most of their profit.
Nope.
And
just
that's what I'm talking about.
Share.
If they're paying fair share, that's a totally different story.
I think you bring up a very valid point. I think I consider myself an even Steven. If a small business is paying this, there's no reason why the larger corporation should be exempt from it. And I think most reasonable people would agree with that.
Okay.
And I think Dick would agree with that, as do I.
Yeah.
I don't think they should be exempt from the income tax.
But there's people that want to go for the juggler, so to speak, and I've heard that before. Close the loopholes and then some. You have to be careful what you're saying there.
Sure.
You don't want to discourage business.
No. At least Dan and I are saying just make them pay their fair share. So
and I would
that I would agree with 110%.
All right, excellent. Very good. We're out of time, but I want to thank you both very much for being
Thanks
here.
a lot.
And,
Boy, what a congenial meeting we had.
Yes.
You know, and I commend both of you for
Hey, he's a good guy. He's a neighbor.
Okay.
He's got a
All
great
right,
family.
let me wrap it up before they just cut us off here. So thanks very much for joining us. Be sure and go to the polls on Tuesday, November 4th, and cast your ballot. These gentlemen are running for the 53rd Assembly District. We'll see you next time. Until then, take good care. Keep your eye on us. We've got our eye on Oshkosh.